Karen, a 59-year-old military wife, had always trusted her husband Eric with her life. But as time passed, she began to notice unsettling signs, a growing distance, and strange behavior. Little did she know, the man she had devoted her life to was hiding a dark secret, an affair with their daughter Meta, and a plot to kill her for a $2 million life insurance payout. What began as a suspicion soon changed into a deadly game of deception and betrayal. The winds were cold in the small village of Skane, Denmark, where nothing much ever seemed to stir except the occasional ship on the horizon and the swaying of the coastal trees. Here, in a modest house near the water, lived 59-year-old Karen Lindholm. A devoted wife to a decorated military officer, Eric, Karen's life had always revolved around her family. She was the silent force behind Eric's career, ensuring their home was a place of peace after his long deployment. Together, they raised 2 children, the youngest being 22-year-old Meta. Life seemed idyllic. On the surface, there were no cracks, no signs of unrest. But beneath the calm, things were unraveling, unseen by the eyes of the public, yet painfully clear to Karen. Over the years, her relationship with Eric had changed. He was no longer the man she married. The affectionate husband she had once known seemed distant. The phone calls during the night, the unexplained absences, and the sudden, secretive behavior planted seeds of doubt in Karen's mind. She had never questioned Eric's loyalty before. After all, they had built a life together, survived the hardships of military life, and raised a daughter who was now an adult. But Karen couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. Her suspicions grew over the course of several months. She noticed how Eric's tone had become colder, how he spoke to Meta with more warmth than he ever did to her. At first it was subtle. An affectionate pat on Meta's shoulder, a lingering gaze, the small things that went unnoticed by everyone except Karen. She brushed it off as her own insecurities, as age and time taking their toll on her marriage. Yet, there was something about Eric's manner that set off alarm bells in her mind. She began to question everything, their history, their promises, and the love she thought they shared. One winter evening, Karen decided to follow her instincts. She had always trusted Eric implicitly, but now she couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Meta had gone out with friends and Eric was unusually late coming home from a supposed work dinner. Karen waited, staring out the window at the empty street. As the clock ticked past midnight, she felt a pang of discomfort. There was a strange, unsettling stillness in the house. The door creaked open, and Eric walked in, his face tense. That night, Karen couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thoughts swirling in her mind. The following day she confronted Eric, but he deflected her questions. He told her she was imagining things, that he was just tired from work. Karen's suspicions only deepened. She knew there was something he wasn't telling her. He began to act even more distant, and over the weeks, Karen's unease transformed into a quiet dread. She decided to take matters into her own hands. It wasn't until one cold afternoon, when Eric was away on a military assignment, that Karen stumbled across an envelope hidden in his office. It was a letter, a love letter, to her daughter. The ink on the paper was smudged, as though the writer had hastily signed it. Karen's heart stopped as she read the words. There, in black and white, were declarations of love from Eric to Meti. Her hands trembled as the weight of the discovery hit her. The affair had been going on for months, maybe longer. Her daughter, the one person she had trusted implicitly, had betrayed her. Karen was devastated, her mind racing with questions. How long had this been happening? Why hadn't she noticed? The anger that bubbled up inside her was overwhelming. She had been blindsided, humiliated by the 2 people she had loved and trusted most. For days, Karen was consumed by a storm of emotions. Betrayal, hurt, disbelief. The relationship she had with Eric had been shattered, and now her daughter, the girl she had raised with so much love, was involved in something so dark. Karen couldn't bring herself to speak to Mete. Every time she saw her daughter, she felt a sense of betrayal so deep it physically hurt. But she couldn't hide forever. The confrontation was inevitable. On a quiet morning, Karen summoned Meta into the living room. The moment Meta stepped inside, Karen's heart raced. Meta, looking innocent as ever, sat across from her mother, unaware of the storm that had gathered. Karen's eyes burned with a mixture of sadness and fury. She handed Meta the letter without saying a word. Meta took it, her face going pale as she realized what her mother had uncovered. The silence between them was unbearable, thick with the weight of truth. Meta tried to deny it at first, claiming that it was a mistake, that Eric had taken advantage of her. But Karen could see through the lies, could hear the fear in her daughter's voice as the truth slowly unraveled. The pain was too much to bear. Karen felt as if she was drowning in a sea of betrayal and shame. The rest of the day was a blur for Karen. Her thoughts were racing, each moment heavier than the last. Meta's tearful apologies did little to soothe her. In fact, they only added fuel to the fire burning inside her. The thought of Eric's betrayal, his actions with her own flesh and blood, was more than Karen could stomach. The weight of it all was too much. Karen's mind became clouded with thoughts of vengeance. She thought of the life she had built with Eric, the sacrifices she had made, the years spent raising their children, the love she had once felt for him, and now it was all a lie. Her marriage, her family, everything she had worked so hard to protect had been shattered by Eric's affair, and Meta, her daughter, was complicit. It was all too much for Karen to process, and as she sat alone in the dark, the thoughts became louder and louder. But Karen wasn't the kind of woman to let something like this go. She would make them pay for what they had done to her, for the devastation they had caused in her life. The plan began to form in her mind, a dark, vengeful plan that would bring everything crashing down. The days following Karen's discovery were filled with a mixture of numbness and seething rage. She went through the motions of daily life, cooking meals and taking care of household tasks, but inside, she felt as if she were being slowly suffocated by the weight of betrayal. Every time she looked at Eric or Meta, the two faces that had once brought her comfort, she was consumed by anger. The image of Eric's letter, his words of affection directed at her own daughter, haunted her thoughts day and night. Eric, ever the military man, continued with his routine. He did not seem to sense the storm growing within Karen. He went about his day-to-day activities, calling home to check in and sending the occasional text message to his wife. But Karen was no longer the woman he had married. She was a woman betrayed, a woman who had seen the ugliness of the secrets he kept hidden for so long. Meta, on the other hand, avoided Karen as much as possible. She was now aware of her mother's discovery, but the guilt she felt only seemed to deepen the tension between them. Meta's usual carefree demeanor had disappeared, replaced by a cloud of shame and guilt that followed her wherever she went. She tried to apologize, to explain herself, but Karen couldn't bring herself to accept any of it. The words felt empty, and her daughter's tears were nothing more than a shallow attempt to erase the irreversible damage that had been done. Despite the turmoil inside her, Karen was determined to remain calm, at least on the surface. She needed to think, to plan. She knew that she couldn't just let this betrayal slide. She couldn't live in a house with Eric and Meta knowing what they had done, and as much as she hated herself for thinking it, there was a part of her that couldn't let go of the idea of revenge. The pain she felt was unbearable, and she knew that she had to make them understand just how deeply they had hurt her. Over the next week, Karen began to observe the movements of Eric more closely. He was, as always, preoccupied with his military duties. He spent long hours on the phone with colleagues and attended several evening meetings related to his job. Karen knew that he was trying to distract himself, but she also knew that his attention was divided. His affair, the one that had torn their family apart, had not been the only thing occupying his thoughts. There was money involved, a large sum of it, and that was something Karen had not overlooked. Eric had taken out a $2 million life insurance policy several years ago. It had seemed like a sensible thing at the time, a way to secure Karen's future in case anything happened to him, but Karen couldn't help but wonder if this policy had become something far darker in Eric's mind. She had never questioned it before, but now, after everything that had come to light, she began to think that Eric might have been planning something far more sinister. Her thoughts twisted into a terrifying idea. What if Eric's affair with Meta wasn't the only secret he was keeping from her? What if he had orchestrated this entire situation for the sake of that life insurance policy? What if he had planned to get rid of her once and for all, using Meta as a pawn in his twisted game? The thought sent a chill down Karen's spine, but she couldn't dismiss it. It made too much sense. It made too much sense. As the days passed, Karen became consumed by the idea of the money, the insurance, and the growing suspicion that Eric was not the man she thought he was. She began to piece together the clues, the late-night meetings, the sudden changes in his behavior, the absence of any real emotion from him after the affair was discovered. Karen started to believe that Eric had a plan, and if that was the case, then she would have to act before it was too late. One afternoon, Karen took a drive into the nearby city. She needed to clear her mind, but more than that, she needed to gather information. She went to the bank, requesting a copy of Eric's life insurance policy, knowing that it would be the key to uncovering the truth. The policy had been taken out in both her name and Eric's, but there were clauses in the contract that hinted at a darker motive. Karen read the fine print, and her suspicions were confirmed. In the event of her death, Eric would receive the full $2 million payout. But there was a catch. If her death was ruled a murder, the payout would be voided. The idea sent a shockwave through Karen. She had been living in the same house as the man who might have been plotting her death. It was surreal to think that her own husband, the man she had shared a life with for over 3 decades, could be capable of such a thing. But the more Karen thought about it, the clearer it became. She wasn't just a victim of a betrayal. She was a target. And Eric wasn't the only one who stood to gain from her death. Karen's mind raced. She thought about her daughter, Meta. Could she be in on this? Had Meta been manipulated by Eric into playing a role in his plan? The question gnawed at her. If Eric had convinced Meta to go along with it, to betray her in the most intimate and unforgivable way, then Karen knew that her daughter would never be the same again, and the idea that she could be an unwitting accomplice in her father's plot was almost too much to bear. Karen returned home that evening with a newfound sense of clarity. She had to act fast. She couldn't let Eric get away with this, not if he was planning to kill her, and she couldn't let Meta go on living with this secret, a secret that would inevitably consume her. The betrayal was too much, and Karen couldn't simply wait for things to unfold. She needed to take control of the situation before it was too late. Want to know how far some people will go for money and power? What lengths will they take to keep their darkest secrets hidden? Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Her first move was clear. She would confront Eric, but this time it would not be about forgiveness. It would not be about patching things up. No, this time, Karen would make Eric understand that she knew everything. She had seen through his lies, and she would make sure that he would never get away with it. But Karen knew she had to be careful. She couldn't act too hastily. One wrong move could destroy everything, and she wasn't willing to take that risk. She would wait for the perfect moment, the right time to expose Eric for the man he truly was. And when that moment came, there would be no turning back. The days following Karen's realization were a blur of planning and observation. Every interaction with Eric felt calculated, almost mechanical. She knew she had to be precise, had to approach the situation with both caution and resolve. There was no room for error. If Eric had, indeed, been plotting her murder, she needed to find irrefutable evidence. Her instincts told her she was on the right path, but the weight of the situation left her feeling increasingly isolated, even from her own thoughts. She spent the next several days retracing Eric's steps, observing his behavior with new eyes. At times it felt like watching a stranger. The man who had once been her confidant, her partner in life, was now an enigma. He had become cold and distant, but she also noticed subtle changes. Moments when his attention strayed toward her and his eyes lingered just a moment too long. It was as if he were calculating something, weighing the possibility of his actions being exposed. Karen had grown used to Eric's long work hours. The military assignments that often kept him away from home for days or even weeks. But now, she began to question everything. The trips that seemed innocent enough before now raised suspicion. What could he possibly be doing when he was away? She thought back to the times he had been stationed overseas, how she had never truly understood the extent of his absences. There were pieces she had overlooked, snippets of conversations, oddities in his behavior that now made sense in a terrifying way. Karen began to take notes in a journal, documenting each movement, every peculiar occurrence. She realized that the more she learned about Eric's life insurance policy and his growing detachment, the less she trusted him. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but they painted a horrifying picture. Meanwhile, Mettie's behavior became increasingly erratic. Karen noticed her daughter withdrawing from her, spending more time in her room, avoiding family meals. The guilt that Mettie must have been feeling was evident in her eyes, though she remained silent. It was clear that the affair had damaged their relationship beyond repair, but Karen couldn't shake the suspicion that Mettie's role in the unfolding drama went deeper than she had initially realized. Could Eric have convinced her to do more than simply participate in the affair? Had Mette unknowingly been part of a larger, more dangerous scheme? Karen couldn't ignore the possibility that her daughter's involvement in this nightmare was far from over. It wasn't until one evening, when Eric was away on a military assignment, that Karen decided to take further action. She knew it was time to confront him, to lay out all the pieces she had uncovered. But before she did, she needed to know just how far Eric's plans had gone. Was he planning to murder her? Or had she been caught in the web of a scheme that she didn't yet fully understand? That evening, Karen made her way to the attic, where Eric kept a number of personal belongings. She knew that the key to unlocking the truth might be hidden somewhere in the stacks of old papers, forgotten boxes, and family heirlooms. As she rifled through the items, her heart raced. She uncovered old photos of their early years together, faded mementos of their marriage, but what truly caught her attention were the documents that lay beneath the pile. There she found papers relating to the life insurance policy, along with receipts for payments and communications between Eric and his insurance agent. One document in particular caught her eye, a policy amendment that had been added quietly, without her knowledge, just a few months before the affair began. The amendment was specific. It detailed a change in the beneficiary. Karen's name had been removed and Mette's was added. The new clause made it clear that if Karen were to die in an accidental death, Mette would be the sole beneficiary of the $2 million payout. The realization hit Karen like a ton of bricks. Eric had planned not only to betray her emotionally, but to erase her entirely, leaving his own daughter as the one to collect the life insurance money. It was then that Karen realized the full scope of Eric's plot. This wasn't just about infidelity. It wasn't even just about the affair with Mette. This was a cold, calculated attempt to eliminate her from the picture, using his own daughter to claim a life insurance payout that could solve his financial troubles. The shock of it all left Karen numb, but it also steeled her resolve. She would not let Eric get away with this. She had to act, but she needed to be careful. Rushing into anything would only play into his hands. After hours of searching through the documents, Karen finally stood up and took a deep breath. The pieces were all there. She had seen enough to understand what had been happening, but now she had to plan her next move. Confronting Eric without the upper hand would be dangerous, and Karen knew that he would try to cover his tracks once he realized she was onto him. She had to be smarter, more strategic. In the days that followed, Karen kept her observations to herself. She no longer felt the need to express her anger openly. She had learned to control it, to mask it beneath the surface. Eric continued with his military duties, coming and going as usual, while Karen carefully set her plan into motion. She knew she couldn't confront him immediately. She needed to find more evidence, something irrefutable that would leave Eric with no choice but to face the consequences of his actions. Mette, too, became more of an enigma. Karen couldn't shake the feeling that her daughter was hiding something, and despite the guilt she displayed, Karen knew she couldn't rely on her. Mette might have been manipulated, but that didn't absolve her of her role in the affair, and the more Karen thought about it, the more it became clear. Mette had been complicit, whether knowingly or unknowingly, in Eric's betrayal. She was a pawn in a dangerous game, but Karen couldn't bring herself to forgive her just yet. As the weeks went on, the tension in the house continued to rise. Karen's vigilance paid off when she uncovered a final piece of the puzzle, an incriminating phone call. Eric, on one of his rare days off, had received a call that Karen had overheard while passing by his office. The conversation, though brief, was telling. Eric had been speaking with someone about an opportunity, and there was no mistaking the tone in his voice. He was speaking about a plan, and the specifics were all too clear. Karen felt a chill run down her spine. Her husband was not only plotting her murder, but he had also gone as far as to involve others. He was too far gone, and now there was only one course of action left. Karen knew that the only way to stop him was to confront him head-on, but she also knew that it would come with consequences, ones she would have to face no matter what. The pieces were finally in place, and the time to act had come. Karen knew her time was running out. Every moment that passed, every day she spent observing Eric and Mette, the more the tension in the house thickened. She had become a stranger in her own home, moving through the rooms like a ghost, while the two people closest to her, her husband and daughter, remained blissfully unaware of the trap she had set for them. But it wasn't enough. No matter how much information she had gathered, how much evidence she had stacked up, Karen knew it wasn't going to be easy. Confronting Eric wouldn't guarantee her safety. The consequences of exposing him and his plot would be irreversible, and there was no turning back. She had become accustomed to being on edge, constantly watching for the slightest sign of Eric's suspicions. He was a military man, trained to detect threats, and Karen had no illusions about how easily he could turn the tables on her if he discovered her plan. She had to be careful. Every move had to be calculated. As the days went by, she honed her skills of deception, hiding her true thoughts behind a look of normalcy. They had no idea, she thought to herself, how far she was willing to go to protect herself. But the weight of the situation grew heavier with each passing day. It wasn't just Eric she had to worry about anymore. It was Mette too. Karen knew her daughter had played a part in the affair, but as the evidence began to mount, she started to realize the extent of Mette's involvement. She had seen how Eric had tried to distance himself from his daughter emotionally, how he treated her like an outsider. Yet, the affair had tied them together in ways that Karen couldn't fully understand. The fact that Mette stood to inherit the life insurance money was enough to make Karen question everything. Had Mette been in on the plot from the beginning, or was she simply a pawn in Eric's ruthless game? Karen knew that she couldn't trust Mette, not anymore. Her heart ached at the thought of betraying her own flesh and blood, but the truth was undeniable. Her daughter had been manipulated, perhaps unknowingly, by Eric. The thought that Mette could be part of the conspiracy, whether as a willing accomplice or simply a pawn, broke Karen's heart. But she couldn't afford to let sentimentality cloud her judgment. Her survival depended on her ability to think rationally, and that meant confronting the painful truth. In the quiet of the night, as Eric was away on yet another military assignment, Karen made her decision. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to confront Eric. It wasn't just about exposing him. It was about taking control of her own life again. She had allowed herself to be manipulated for too long, had been blinded by love and loyalty, but now, with everything laid bare before her, she saw Eric for what he truly was, a man who was willing to destroy her for the sake of greed. The confrontation would be difficult, there was no doubt about that, but Karen was determined. The love she had once felt for Eric had long since turned to ashes, replaced by the cold realization that he was a man she no longer recognized. Her thoughts, once filled with affection for her husband, had been replaced by thoughts of survival. She was ready for whatever came next. When Eric returned home, he didn't suspect a thing. He walked in, as he always did, acting as if everything was normal. Karen watched him carefully, noting the slight hesitation in his steps, the way he kept glancing toward her as if he could sense that something was wrong. She knew the time had come. She waited until they were alone in the living room, and then, with a calmness that surprised even her, Karen began to speak. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times, but now, with the weight of everything resting on her shoulders, the words came out smoother than she anticipated. She told Eric she knew about the affair, the life insurance policy, and the plan to kill her. She described every detail she had uncovered. Everything she had pieced together. She watched Eric's face as she spoke, his expression shifting from confusion to shock, then to fear. But it wasn't until she mentioned Meta's name that Eric's appearance finally cracked. The silence that followed was suffocating. Karen could feel the tension in the room, could see the thoughts racing through Eric's mind as he processed her words. The man who had once been her husband, the one she had trusted with her life, now stood before her, exposed, vulnerable. His face, once proud and confident, was now a mask of guilt and shame. But Karen wasn't done. She wasn't going to let him walk away unscathed. The anger she had held in check for so long began to bubble to the surface, but she didn't let it control her. She couldn't afford to let it take over. Eric tried to justify his actions, to explain away the betrayal. He claimed that it was never meant to happen this way, that he had only wanted to secure their future. But Karen didn't believe him. She knew better. She had seen the coldness in his eyes, the way he had looked at her in recent weeks. There was no remorse in his voice, no real apology. It was all a lie. As the confrontation reached its peak, Karen realized that Eric wasn't going to go down without a fight. He would try to manipulate her, to twist the situation to his advantage. But she was prepared for that. She had already planned her next move. As the conversation drew to a close, Karen made one final statement. She told Eric that she was going to the authorities. She had already gathered enough evidence to ensure that he would be caught. There was no way out for him now. Eric, knowing the game was up, grew desperate. His demeanor shifted again, but this time it wasn't the cold, calculating military man that Karen had known. Instead, he became the man she had once loved, a man who was afraid of losing everything. In a last-ditch attempt to save himself, he begged her to reconsider, to keep the truth between them. He promised that he would make things right, that they could start over. But Karen knew better. She knew that there was no going back from what had been done. Eric had crossed a line that could never be undone. Karen didn't say another word. She turned and walked away, leaving Eric in that moment of desperate vulnerability. The path ahead of her was unclear, but one thing was certain. She had taken back control of her life, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her again. The authorities were notified soon after. Eric was arrested, and the investigation into the murder plot unfolded as Karen had anticipated. The evidence was overwhelming, and his betrayal of both his wife and daughter was laid bare for the world to see. Meta, too, was questioned, though it became clear that she had been manipulated by Eric into being a part of the scheme. Karen's life would never be the same. The scars of betrayal, the weight of the events that had unfolded, would stay with her forever. But she was free, and that, in the end, was all that mattered. What would you do if you discovered your family was a part of a deadly conspiracy? Subscribe now for more jaw-dropping true crime stories and uncover the secrets that hide behind closed doors.